welcome back to the deep dive. You know those days, those singular dates on the calendar when it feels like everything happens at once?
Definitely.
Major political crises colliding with, I don't know, surprising events from space or even the courtroom.
Yeah, those perfect storm kind of days.
November 12, 2025
Yeah.
was exactly that kind of day. Just stark contrasts everywhere. Washington finding this temporary fragile peace while global conflicts were heating up.
Yeah.
And then, a severe solar storm, just reminding us that some big threats aren't even earthly.
It really was an extraordinary moment of collision. When we dug into the sources for this date, the sheer number of critical things happening simultaneously, it was staggering.
Right.
You had the end of the longest ever government shutdown, major shifts in geopolitics. The stakes were just incredibly high economically and, well, in human terms too, with some of these policy failures.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to cut through all that noise. We're taking this whole stack of source material, synthesizing it down, and pulling out the key knowledge you need. Think of it as the shortcut to understanding the immediate fallout from that huge U.S. political crisis.
And the shifts on battlefields far away, too.
Exactly. And also why things like, a specific autonomous truck design or the very last pennies being minted suddenly became these important signals of change.
We've structured this deep dive to give you that context and, importantly, the consequences. We'll kick off in D.C., unpacking the shutdown's economic fallout and the fractures it exposed in the social safety net.
Okay.
Then we'll pivot globally. Look at new tensions from Ukraine's front lines to a really critical diplomatic spat between key intelligence allies.
All right.
And finally, we hit those aha moments, like you said, the end of the Lincoln era, which is kind of symbolic, and the very real dangers from that confirmed G4 geomagnetic storm.
It's a lot to cover, definitely. So let's unpack this. We really have to start in Washington, D.C. Because the biggest news, the thing that kind of calmed market nerves, was the resolution, temporary, yes, but official, of the longest government shutdown in U.S. history.
Right.
And to really grasp the scale here, we're talking about a closure that started way back on October 1st, 2025. And it dragged on for, 42 or 43 days?
That's right, 42 or 43 days, just unprecedented territory.
And what that meant was this fundamental freeze across huge parts of the federal government. Services delayed.
Tertial services.
And maybe most critically for the economy, it held up key data. Data the Federal Reserve absolutely needs to, set interest rate policy.
That's the real enduring damage of the sheer length of it. A 42-day closure isn't just like a political inconvenience, it's a systemic shock.
Right.
You had hundreds of thousands of federal workers furloughed or working without pay, and the delay in government services created these bottlenecks all through the economy. Think about sectors needing permits, inspections, guaranteed funding.
All just stopped.
Basically, yeah. Ground to a halt in many cases.
And Congress had, somewhat frustratingly, been in recess for part of that time. But on November 12th, the political wheels finally started turning again.
The momentum finally hit a point where they had to act. The Republican-led House prepared for this vote, specifically designed just to end the immediate crisis.
Okay, so how did they actually resolve it? What was the mechanism?
Yeah, the mechanism itself tells you a lot about the dysfunction, really. It wasn't some grand bargain, no big budget deal or omnibus bill.
Yeah.
It was a continuing resolution, a CR.
The CR.
Yeah.
Classic Washington move.
Exactly. Putting it simply, a CR is basically Congress saying, look, we can't agree on anything permanent right now, so we're just going to keep funding things at the current levels, but only for a really short, specific time. This compromise got funding restored through January, agencies open, paychecks flowing again.
So they didn't solve the underlying budget fights at all. They just kicked the can down the road, hit the snooze button, maybe.
Precisely. Kicked the can is the perfect analogy. And economists, political analysts, they all warned immediately. Funding only through January just sets up another round of brinkmanship. Another budget fight early next year is basically guaranteed.
Because the core issues.
Unresolved. Completely. The big ideological fights over border funding, spending caps, entitlements, they're all still there, waiting.
So the CR mechanism itself pretty much ensures this crisis comes back. Probably right in the middle of primary season, too, which just ramps up the political pressure.
Okay, so turning to the markets. We saw a bit of relief, right? But was it because they believed this fix would last, or was something else going on?
Well, they'd already priced in the resolution earlier in the week. The deal looked pretty certain by then.
Okay.
So the actual reaction on November 12th was pretty moderate. Some modest gains, Treasury yields dipped a bit, which shows relief that the immediate uncertainty was gone.
But the real focus wasn't the deal itself.
Not entirely. The real focus, the bigger reason for the relief, was the expectation of all that delayed economic data finally coming out. Right, the economic data freezer door finally creaking open.
Exactly. The Fed had been, in their own words, basically flying blind. They hadn't had fresh, reliable reports on inflation, jobs, consumer spending, housing starts for over a month.
Wow.
So now the agencies are back, those reports are coming, and the market is just waiting for that flood of information. Because Fed policy and whether this rally keeps going depends entirely on what that delayed data actually shows. The shutdown didn't stop the economy, but it stopped our ability to measure it accurately for a while, and that's a huge risk for policymakers. #2, fractures in the social safety net.
Yeah, that systemic shock is one thing. But the shutdown also really laid bare these acute, almost tragic vulnerabilities in the social safety net, specifically with SNA, right, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program.
This is where the human cost of political paralysis becomes just undeniable.
Right.
While some federal aid programs have these automatic triggers to keep funding flowing during lapses, this shutdown was so long it strained everything. And the legal complexities around SNAP created this devastating impact on food security, especially, with Thanksgiving just around the corner.
Right, and we learned the Supreme Court actually got involved, extending a temporary pause on benefit distribution. Can you walk us through the scale of that disruption?
Let's get specific with the numbers because they're stark. Sources indicate this affected the distribution of about $4 billion in S&P benefits.
$1 billion? Wow.
Yeah, and that decision, extending a temporary legal hold, directly hit nearly 42 million recipients.
42 million people.
Almost 42 million. And the logistical chaos for state agencies was immediate. They were getting conflicting legal signals. Lower courts had issued injunctions blocking certain rules. Then the Supreme Court stepped in to stay those injunctions.
So the states were caught in the middle.
Yeah.
Paralyzed, essentially.
Pretty much. They couldn't safely disperse the funds while waiting for judicial clarity. And this ties into some really complex legal stuff, recent policy changes around work requirements, eligibility criteria, things that were already being challenged in court.
Okay.
So when the funding mechanism breaks down during a legal challenge and a government lapse, the whole system just seizes up. Anti-hunger advocates were calling it an unprecedented logistical nightmare, right before one of the biggest food holidays. It put immense strain on food banks, which just couldn't absorb that level of demand suddenly.
And there was some dissent within the court on this action, wasn't there?
Yes, that's right. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson was specifically noted as dissenting from the court's decision to extend that temporary pause. It really underscores the deep legal controversy and the humanitarian concerns around it.
So even though the shutdown itself ended on November 12th, this SNAP crisis continued to reverberate, exposing these longer-term systemic problems.
Absolutely. Advocacy groups were immediately demanding clearer protocols. They want Congress and the courts to set up non-negotiable rules for distributing essential benefits during future standoffs.
Makes sense.
Because this episode proved that just saying, oh, we'll reopen the government eventually, doesn't fix the immediate failure of the safety net. The mechanisms designed to protect the most vulnerable during a crisis broke down. It really highlights a critical fracture in the resilience of the country's, humanitarian infrastructure. #3, populist policy and presidential scrutiny.
Okay, shifting gears a bit, but still in Washington. Even as this shutdown resolved, the political landscape was still pretty fractured, right? We saw this key populist policy proposal get reaffirmed. And at the exact same time, this huge political firestorm erupted over accountability and, scandal.
Let's take the policy first. The White House, even with all the shutdown drama, made a point to reiterate President Trump's strong support for a specific economic idea, this $2,000 annual dividend for Americans.
Right. And this wasn't like a UBI thing funded by general taxes, was it? It was tied specifically to trade policy.
That's the unique angle, exactly. It would be financed entirely by income from tariffs.
Okay.
Supporters frame it as, sharing the direct proceeds of fair trade policies with everyday Americans. The argument is, if the government collects money on foreign goods coming into the U.S., that money should go directly back to citizens, almost like a rebate check.
So the idea is using tariffs, which a lot of opponents would just call a tax on consumers, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Using that money for direct payments. But what are the big economic red flags with that plan?
Well, economists are really deeply split on this. It's politically appealing, obviously, but the economic consensus against it is pretty significant.
How's that?
Opponents warn that tariffs almost always get passed on to consumers through higher prices at the checkout. So the $2,000 dividend could just be canceled out by everything costing more. Best case, it's a wash. Worst case, it's actually inflationary. Plus, implementing it could seriously mess with global supply chains and provoke retaliation from other countries, hitting U.S. exporters hard think agriculture and manufacturing.
Okay. So while that economic debate was simmering, Washington's attention got yanked sideways by this political flashpoint that literally dropped the same day as the shutdown vote. House Democrats publicized subpoenaed documents related to Jeffrey Epstein.
The timing there is just
Yeah.
critical. Releasing that instantly injected this highly charged, high-stakes story back into the news cycle. It made sure that government reopening wasn't the only thing people were talking about.
Right.
And the documents themselves, emails, messages subpoenaed by House Democrats, included a 2019 email from Epstein claiming that then-President Trump knew about the girls.
Wow. That's an explosive allegation. What was the immediate reaction? Predictably partisan?
Pure, unadulterated partisan warfare. Trump allies immediately slammed the release, called it a politically motivated leak, a distraction, a fake narrative designed purely to smear him.
Mm-hmm.
They pointed to the timing right during the shutdown resolution as blatant political maneuvering. On the flip side, Democrats argued the material was serious, demanded deeper investigation, focused on ethics and accountability.
But what's the sort of sober legal take on that specific piece of evidence, that private email from 2019?
Yeah, legal experts pumped the brakes pretty quickly on the immediate shock value. While the disclosure is politically damaging, that ambiguous phrasing in a private email needs substantial independent corroboration.
Right, it's not proof in itself.
Exactly. It's not a legal indictment. It's a political claim needing real factual backup. But still, having the story break right alongside the budget deal just ensured that Washington's attention stayed completely fractured. It really highlights that constant battle between policy, economics, and high-profile scandal.
Okay, let's transition now from the political heat in Washington to the slightly more nervous energy on Wall Street. The shutdown resolution gave things a general lift, sure, but if you look closely at the market tickers, that rally wasn't exactly uniform, was it? #4. Uneven market performance and the tech wobble.
That's the key takeaway, really, selectivity. The Dow Jones did hit record levels, yeah. That reflects the broad relief that this big chunk of political uncertainty was finally off the table.
Okay.
And investors, especially in the weeks leading up to this, had been rotating into cyclical names, companies like industrials, energy stocks, the ones that usually benefit when people think economic growth is looking strong and stable.
But the tech sector, which has been driving so much of the market lately, it faced some specific headwinds that day. What was putting pressure on the NASDAQ specifically?
Right. The NASDAQ, heavily weighted with growth and tech stocks, definitely felt some pressure. It came down to two specific high-profile company stories.
Okay, what were they?
First, CoreWeave, the autonomous computing firm, kind of stumbled. There was some news about financing or maybe operations, and that often makes investors suddenly scrutinize the valuations of similar companies.
Right, the ripple effect.
Exactly. And second, arguably more impactful, was news that SoftBank was selling off a chunk of its huge stake in NVIDIA.
Ah, NVIDIA. The semiconductor giant, basically the absolute bellwether for the whole AI infrastructure boom.
Precisely. So when a major, sophisticated investor like SoftBank starts selling a significant chunk of the AI bellwether,
People get nervous.
yeah, it raises concerns, like, have the valuations peaked? That sale put direct, measurable downward pressure on a lot of AI-related stocks. It made the overall rally feel a bit top-heavy, uneven.
So Wall Street took a big breath, relieved the government was open, but then immediately pivoted to the next big uncertainty, interest rates.
Absolutely. Market strategists were pretty much unanimous on this. The political cloud lifted, okay, but the market's path heading into year-end now depends entirely on how the Federal Reserve reacts to that flood of delayed economic data we talked about earlier.
Right. What will the numbers show?
Exactly. Will inflation look cool enough for the Fed to maybe signal rate cuts? Or will strong job numbers force them to keep rates higher for longer? That policy direction is everything now. It'll determine if the broader rally keeps going or if investors get even more selective, maybe shifting towards defensive stocks or dividend payers.
Speaking of tech and these big systemic changes, another name grabbing headlines was Einride. That's the Swedish autonomous and electric trucking company. Their public market debut seems to signal there's still an appetite for the future of logistics.
It does, yeah. But it also signals the enduring appeal of going public via a special purpose acquisition company,
Yeah.
even after that earlier SPAC bubble kind of burst. Einride announced they'd go public through a SPAC merger. Just to clarify for listeners, a SPAC is essentially a blank check company. It raises money first, with the sole goal of finding a private company, buying it, and taking it public, often faster than a traditional IPO.
So why the SPAC route for Einride, and what kind of valuation are we talking about?
The implied valuation is pretty hefty, around $1.8 billion. The SPAC route is often attractive for capital-intensive industries like autonomous freight because it offers a more certain upfront capital injection.
Which they definitely need for scaling up.
Exactly. Essential for scaling their pretty unique technology.
Yeah.
Einride's known for that distinctive cabless design, the pod.
Right, the one with no driver's seat.
Yeah. Their whole pitch is this mix. Electrified freight plus remote human operation like drone pilots, but for trucks as this necessary practical bridge to get to full autonomy on all roads eventually.
That idea of remote operation as a bridge, it makes a lot of logistical sense. But going from prototypes to like a massive global freight operation, that seems like a huge leap. What are the main challenges for Einride now that they're public?
Profitability really hinges on three big interconnected things. First, scaling the hardware. They need to mass produce those pods reliably and, crucially, cost effectively.
Yeah.
Second, and this is a massive one, building out the charging infrastructure needed for a huge electric fleet, whether it's their own or through partners. Downtime is death in logistics, so charging has to be fast and everywhere.
Huge hurdle.
And third is navigating the regulations. Safety rules for cabless vehicles, for autonomous operation. They're constantly changing, and they vary wildly between U.S. states and between the U.S. and the EU.
A patchwork quilt of rules.
Exactly. Navigating that patchwork is a major operational and financial risk. Investors are essentially betting that Einride can manage all that complexity. #6, marking the close of the Lincoln Cent era. Okay, now for something maybe quieter, but culturally really resonant, the end of a long era. On November 12th, U.S. Mint officials in Philadelphia produced the very last batch of pennies,
Wow.
formally ending the 116-year production run of the Lincoln Cent.
116 years. It feels like a real marker of time passing, doesn't it? I remember when Canada got rid of their penny years ago, wondering if the U.S. would ever follow. What was the final undeniable reason to retire it?
It really just boiled down to cost and utility, driven by the digital shift. The simple, kind of brutal economic truth is that it cost the government about 1.7 cents, 0.01 cents, to physically make and distribute one single penny.
More than it's worth.
Way more. The government was literally losing money making loose change. Plus, cash transactions just keep shrinking as a share of overall commerce. So the U.S. is basically catching up to Canada, New Zealand, Australia, others who realized their lowest value coin was just an economic liability.
Okay, so for you, the listener, maybe someone who still uses cash sometimes,
Yeah.
how do these new rounding rules actually work in practice?
This is the key distinction. The rounding rules apply only to cash payments.
Okay, only cash.
If you use a credit card, debit card, Apple Pay, whatever the total is exactly the same. $3.99 stays 3.99 cents. But for cash, retailers will now round the total transaction amount up or down to the nearest 5 cents.
I'll give you an example.
Okay, say your total comes to $3.99. Paying with cash, that would likely round up to $4. If your total was, say, $3.97, it would round down to $3.95.
Got it. Will this cause any real inflation, do economists think? Or are the amounts just too small to matter overall?
Economists expect any inflationary impact to be minimal, basically negligible in the grand scheme of the economy. The impact is much more cultural and logistical.
Like for charities.
Exactly. Charities that rely heavily on coin drives, penny jars, that kind of thing, they'll have to adapt their fundraising methods. And of course, there's the immediate impact on coin collectors. They're probably scrambling right now to get pristine rolls of those final 2025 Lincoln cents. It really marks the end of a tangible piece of Americana.
Yeah.
It's a quiet change, but it really speaks volumes about how quickly we're moving towards a less cash society.
Okay, switching gears completely now, let's move overseas. Persistent conflicts, fragile diplomatic agreements. They continued to dominate the global news on November 12th. Ukraine specifically remained this picture of just grinding attrition. #7. Renewed pressure on Ukraine's frontline.
Indeed. We're more than 3 years into Russia's full-scale invasion by this point, and the conflict's nature is just slow, costly, grinding trench warfare almost.
Yeah.
The front lines have shifted, but only incrementally in recent months. Sources were tracking a slow but persistent Russian advance in key areas backed by really heavy artillery and, frankly, high casualties on both sides.
And on November 12th specifically, what were the tactical developments confirming that ongoing pressure?
Reports noted renewed, intense Russian attacks near important eastern logistical hubs, places like Pokrovsk and Zaporizhia.
Okay.
Kiev described these assaults as only partially successful, which implies they held their main defensive lines, but it confirms that sustained, heavy pressure was ongoing. These kinds of movements just underscore how vital continued Western aid is for Kyiv, especially things like long-range air defense and massive amounts of artillery shells.
But the conflict isn't just external, is it? There's the internal dimension, testing Western willingness to keep sending aid. We saw a major corruption probe surface involving a critical state energy company.
This is so critical to the whole geopolitical dynamic. Western support for Ukraine is explicitly tied to Ukraine making robust anti-corruption efforts.
Quite conditional.
Very much so. A major investigation targeted several high-ranking officials, including someone described as a former business associate of President Zelensky. The probe focused heavily on Energoatom, the state-owned nuclear energy company. Energoatom.
Okay. Amid allegations of millions of dollars in graft, basically skimming off state contracts. The international community watches these probes incredibly closely. They're seen as essential proof that Ukraine is serious about governance reform. Any perceived backsliding really threatens that vital aid pipeline. And on the international response side, Canada moved specifically to tighten the screws on Russia, right? Targeting their war-making capacity and their ability to dodge sanctions.
Correct. Canada rolled out new sanctions targeting two strategic areas. First, organizations involved in making and supplying Russian drones, which have been so pivotal on the battlefield. Second, and maybe more insidious, they targeted elements of this so-called shadow fleet. These are ships used to transport Russian oil and other goods illicitly, basically getting around existing international embargoes.
Yeah.
It's part of a broader, coordinated NATO effort, trying to choke off both Russia's military capabilities and the illicit money flows that fund the war. #8, the fragile Middle East and intelligence divides.
Okay, now turning to the Middle East. That U.S. brokered ceasefire between Israel and Hamas proved tragically fragile on this date.
Yeah, sources confirm the ceasefire was breached on November 12th. Israeli forces reportedly killed 3 people in Gaza in the previous 24 hours. It just tragically demonstrated the deep instability and, frankly, the lack of trust on the ground. And compounding that, the United Nations publicly accused Israel of blocking essential aid deliveries, which are absolutely critical for alleviating the severe humanitarian crisis inside Gaza.
And this is where things get incredibly sensitive, right? Straining diplomatic ties. U.S. intelligence apparently revealed some pretty shocking allegations about the conduct of Israeli forces.
Yes, the sources, specifically Reuters citing intelligence officials, reported that U.S. intelligence had picked up discussions among Israeli officials about the potential use of human shields during operations in Gaza.
Wow, a leak like that.
A leak of that nature, alleging conduct that potentially violates international law, is diplomatically explosive. It instantly fueled huge global scrutiny of Israeli policy. And it severely complicated the already incredibly delicate negotiations over future ceasefires and aid access. A U.S. intelligence leak carrying that kind of weight shifts diplomatic leverage instantly.
And this external pressure seemed to coincide with some serious internal debate within Israel itself, too.
Absolutely. The very same day, Israel's president, Isaac Herzog, publicly condemned recent attacks by settlers on Palestinians in the West Bank. He called the violence shocking and urged an immediate stop to it. That kind of high-level condemnation from within Israel underscores deep internal divisions over conduct and governance in the occupied territories. So pressure was building both internationally and from within Israel's own leadership regarding accountability.
And while all this regional instability was flaring, U.S. Central Command confirmed they were still carrying out counter-terror operations in Syria. That remains critical.
Yeah, Seton Tum reported enabling over 22 actions against remaining ISIS elements in Syria, resulting in 5 militants killed, 19 captured. It emphasizes that even with the intense focus on Israel-Gaza and all the diplomatic volatility around that, the long-term grinding pressure on terror cells, often done with local partner forces, has to be maintained to prevent ISIS from regenerating or exploiting the chaos. #9. Security rifts and transnational crime. Now, we really have to highlight a pretty profound diplomatic rift that emerged on November 12th, one that tests the absolute cornerstone of Western intelligence cooperation, the UK-US relationship.
This involves the super-sensitive area of intelligence sharing, specifically around operations targeting drug trafficking in the Caribbean.
Exactly. The UK took the really extraordinary step of suspending intelligence sharing with the US over specific concerns.
Suspending, that's huge.
It's massive. The core issue was the belief, or strong suspicion, that data the UK provided to the Pentagon was then used for potentially illegal, or at least legally questionable and unauthorized, strikes on suspected drug trafficking boats in the Caribbean.
Okay, the UK-US intelligence bond is arguably the strongest, most trusted intel relationship in the West. Goes back decades. For the UK to pause it over questions of accountability and legality in military ops. It highlights really deep concerns about oversight when highly sensitive information gets used kinetically. And at the exact same time this rift is happening behind the scenes, the U.S. was projecting massive, very public military force into that same region to counter the cartels.
Correct. Just as this diplomatic crack appeared, the USS Gerald R. Ford, the world's largest aircraft carrier, was deployed to the Caribbean.
Wow.
It was an overt, assertive show of force aimed squarely at disrupting drug cartels. Military leaders like Colonel Seth Crumrich openly described it as showing strength, basically warning cartels that drug violence and illicit maritime activity wouldn't be tolerated. So you have this massive flexing of military muscle happening publicly.
While the intel relationship is strained privately.
Exactly. A sharp contrast.
And the regional pushback against illicit finance also saw a big move in Mexico, targeting how cartels launder their money.
Yeah, Mexican financial regulators took pretty aggressive action against money laundering, which of course fuels transnational crime all across the Americas. They ordered 13 casinos to halt operations entirely.
13 casinos.
Yep. After uncovering these massive, sophisticated money laundering schemes explicitly linked to international criminal organizations, it really underscores how complex the fight is trying to enforce anti-money laundering rules and cut off the flow of billions in illicit cash that these cartels need to operate.
Okay, as governments are wrestling with budgets and geopolitics, the climate clock just keeps ticking relentlessly. The UN Climate Conference, COP30, was underway in Belém, Brazil, trying to square climate ambition with, economic realities, #10, tensions at the COP30 Climate Summit.
Yeah, the location itself, Belém, Brazil, right on the edge of the Amazon rainforest, immediately set the stage for potential volatility. Brazil's at the absolute nexus of global climate mitigation efforts, economic development pressures, and indigenous rights. It makes land rights and resource issues incredibly charged.
And those tensions didn't just stay outside the conference doors, did they? They actually boiled over into a physical disruption.
They did. Indigenous leaders and allied protesters actually forced their way into the main COP30 venue. They clashed with security, disrupted access to parts of the Blue Zone. That's where the official government negotiations happen.
Wow. What were they carrying? What was the message?
They had these powerful signs chanting, "Our land is not for sale."
Okay.
Their core demands were fundamentally about recognizing and, crucially, enforcing indigenous land rights, and an urgent call to stop illegal land grabs by powerful agribusiness and mining interests, which they say are rampant.
So it really spotlighted that conflict.
Absolutely. This confrontation just throws into sharp relief the deep conflict between the high-level theoretical climate ambition, like setting global emissions targets, and the really difficult, sometimes brutal, on-the-ground enforcement needed in places like the Amazon. Activists there are constantly decrying the expansion of industrial farming and oil exploration projects onto protected or traditional lands.
So it's this clash between global policy goals and very local human rights issues.
Precisely. Now, despite the disruption, the negotiations did eventually resume under tighter security, but the message was definitely delivered. UN officials and Brazil emphasized that, okay, the protests were managed, but the essential talks must continue, reminding delegates that the goal isn't just setting targets, it's also about ensuring environmental justice and pushing back against the climate misinformation that often fuels these land disputes. #Haveloman, severe weather and geological hazards.
Okay, from the human drama of climate politics, let's shift to the raw, unpredictable power of the planet itself. November 12th delivered this extraordinarily severe early-season cold snap across parts of the U.S.
This was a genuine Arctic blast, yeah, and really notable for how severe it was and how early it hit. Forecasters called it one of the coldest early-season outbreaks in decades for some spots in the southeast.
Wow.
It was just this sharp, rapid plunge of polar air way farther south than usual, and it severely tested regional infrastructure that just wasn't ready for deep winter conditions yet.
What were the immediate impacts, especially thinking about travel and logistics?
Well, it caused widespread freezes. We saw scattered reports of light snow or just unusual cold in places that rarely see it that early. Critically, it caused massive disruptions to air travel. Over 1,200 flight cancellations on November 12th alone.
1,200 flights.
Yeah, hubs were struggling with icing, high winds. Utilities had to ramp up power generation immediately. Grid operators were actually urging people to conserve energy. It shows how quickly extreme weather can spike demand. And in agriculture, growers were scrambling, implementing emergency measures to protect vulnerable crops from that sudden, sharp temperature drop.
Meanwhile, down in Hawaii, the sort of constant quiet threat of geological hazards remained a factor too.
Yes, Kilauea volcano continued to show signs of elevated unrest. The USGS kept the alert level at watch and the aviation color code at orange.
And that means,
It's a critical status. It means even on days when it's not erupting lava, there's still a need for constant operational vigilance. The instruments were showing elevated activity, warranting caution for communities downwind because of high gas emissions.
right,
And crucially, for flight operations. Pilots have to navigate the potential for sudden ash plumes or shifts in wind patterns carrying volcanic smog. It's just this constant operational hazard that demands attention, even when there's no lava flowing visibly. Hashtag 12, the power of space weather. Okay, now let's look way, way above the atmosphere. November 12th delivered a totally different kind of threat, a celestial one, a severe geomagnetic storm. This is such a critical reminder that we live in this interconnected system where risks come from Earth and from space.
right. What specifically caused this space weather event?
It was sparked by multiple coronal mass ejections, CMEs. These are powerful bursts of solar plasma and magnetic field hurled out from the sun that then slammed into Earth's magnetosphere. NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center confirmed it reached G4 conditions. G4 means severe on their scale. To put that in perspective, G1 is minor. G4 is capable of causing pretty significant system-wide impacts.
And the visual effects were stunning, right? People saw auroras way outside the usual areas.
An incredible visual show, yeah. Observers reported seeing the northern lights far south of their typical range of visible from the northern plains, deep into the mid-Atlantic. Even parts of the south reported seeing them.
Wow.
For most people, it was just a moment of pure awe, beautiful curtains of light. But the real fascination for us, looking at the systemic implications, is the technical consequences.
What's the critical risk that a G4 storm like that exposes in our modern, superconnected infrastructure?
So what here is immense. Now, on this specific day, the major impacts were mostly limited. Maybe some glitches in satellite navigation, GPS getting a bit drifty, and some disruptions to high-frequency radio communication.
Okay, so not catastrophic this time.
Not this time, luckily. But the event absolutely revived critical discussions about infrastructure resilience. A G4 storm has the very real potential to induce powerful electrical currents in long conductors on the ground. We're talking high-voltage power lines especially.
Right, that can damage transformers.
Exactly. It can lead to transformer failures, potentially causing localized or even regional grid collapses. It also severely impacts satellites in low Earth orbit, LEO constellations, increases atmospheric drag, affects their orbital precision. So this event served as this major, high-profile warning shot. We need massive investment in hardening our power grid and making our satellites more resilient to survive the next major solar flare. Our 20th century infrastructure is just fundamentally not built for 21st century space weather.
Okay, let's shift our focus now to global public health and human security.
Yeah.
November 12th brought both some encouraging milestones in fighting disease, but also some really stark reminders of governance failures, often rooted in economic strain or persistent instability. Hashtag 13.
Global
Health milestones and challenges.
The World Health Organization released its annual Global Tuberculosis Report. This is always a crucial benchmark, especially since TB detection and treatment got severely knocked back by the COVID-19 pandemic. Resources were diverted, diagnoses were missed.
Right, a huge setback. So what did the 2025 report show? Are we catching up?
The news was mixed. Cautiously optimistic, maybe, on the case-finding front. Diagnoses actually had a record 8.3 million globally in 2024.
A record high. That sounds bad.
Well, it's alarming, but it also suggests health systems are finally recovering from the pandemic disruption. They're expanding screening, finding more of the cases that were likely being missed before.
Okay. Improved detection.
Exactly. On the other hand, deaths fell, but only modestly, to 1.23 million. Now, any decline in deaths is good news, obviously, but public health officials were quick to sound the alarm. This progress is incredibly fragile. It's threatened by persistent, massive funding gaps, which could jeopardize the global goal of hitting those 2030 eradication targets.
And the challenge isn't just money, right? It's also the disease itself evolving.
Absolutely. The WHO report had a sharp, persistent warning about the growing threat of drug-resistant TB, and also about uneven access to care around the world. With some major international donors actually cutting back on health budgets, the WHO was urging renewed, significant investment to avoid losing the recent gains. We're basically in this race between funding robust health systems and the evolution of a really dangerous airborne pathogen.
Meanwhile, shifting to the opioid crisis, which is still devastating communities globally, there was a major tactical victory on the enforcement side in North America.
Yes, Canadian authorities announced the largest fentanyl bust in Canadian law enforcement history. They seized record amounts of this extremely potent opioid. Officials hailed it as a major win against the trafficking networks that fuel the public health emergency across North America, especially with synthetic opioids flowing across borders.
But enforcement alone, as we always hear, can't solve the underlying crisis.
That's the crucial caveat, always. While the bust was celebrated for disrupting supply lines, officials and public health leaders immediately acknowledged the need for a much more holistic approach.
Right.
Critics emphasized that reducing supply, even massively, has to be paired with immediate expanded access to addiction treatment and robust prevention programs. Without tackling the demand side and the social factors that drive addiction, enforcement often just shifts the supply routes around rather than solving the deep humanitarian crisis. #14, governance and human security failures. November 12th also gave us these tragic examples of governance failures, sometimes mooted in economic hardship, other times in just persistent instability, starting with a terrible stampede in Ghana.
Yeah, tell us about that tragedy at the recruitment event.
6 people tragically died and many more were injured in a stampede at a Ghana Armed Forces recruitment event. It was at the Elwak Sports Stadium in Accra. Just an overwhelming surge of desperate applicants trying to get into a military selection exercise broke through security barriers. That's awful. And it speaks volumes, doesn't it, about the underlying economic pressures on young people there.
Commentators immediately made that link. They connected this devastating incident directly to Ghana's ongoing economic strains and the intense, almost paralyzing competition for stable public sector jobs. Even with some recent improvements in inflation, the desperation for secure, reliable work is incredibly high, especially among young, often educated people. And that desperation leads to these dangerously overcrowded, uncontrollable situations at highly sought-after recruitment drives. And at the same time, persistent instability continued to target core state institutions in South Asia. A suicide bombing occurred outside a district courthouse in Islamabad, Pakistan. It killed at least 12 people.
Targeting a courthouse specifically. That underscores a deliberate attempt by extremists to undermine the rule of law itself. It does. The incident came after escalating threats from various extremist groups. The government condemned the attack, pledged renewed counterterrorism efforts, naturally. But the event just highlights this persistent, acute instability. And it also raises serious concerns among civil rights activists about the potential for government overreach or abuses in the intensified security response that inevitably follows.
Okay, finally, let's look at the European Union. They were making moves to tackle online threats, but introducing a sort of new governance strategy for controlling information.
Yeah, the EU is constantly grappling with foreign interference, the rapid spread of online lies linked to elections, international conflicts. They're trying to regulate platforms through their big Digital Services Act.
Right.
On November 12th, EU officials outlined a pretty significant new plan. They want to enlist large tech platforms and, interestingly, popular social media creators and influencers more directly in the fight against disinformation and hybrid threats.
Wow, enlisting influencers.
That's fascinating, but also potentially problematic. Targeting the source of narrative spread, not just the platform. What's the fundamental tension there?
Well, supporters see it as pragmatic. They argue traditional fact-checking is just too slow, and narratives spread fastest through trusted online creators, especially reaching younger audiences.
Okay, I can see the logic.
But civil liberties groups immediately raised red flags. Concerns about potential government overreach, about censorship creep, about fundamental free speech risks. How they implement this will be a real test. How does Brussels balance legitimate security needs against essential rights protections, especially ensuring fair and consistent content moderation across all of the EU's different languages and diverse political landscapes?
Yep.
It's a very fine line to walk. Hashtag tag outro.
So we have synthesized just an immense, complex pile of information from this single, incredibly eventful day, November 12th, 2025. We've gone from the fragility of a political truce in D.C. all the way to the raw power of the cosmos. Yeah, the core synthesis, I think, is this. We saw political resolution immediately balanced by overwhelming policy vulnerability. The longest shutdown ended, yes, but that immediate crisis over S&P benefits just exposed these deep systemic fractures in the safety net that political deals alone can't fix.
And the relief was instantly tempered by the promise of more fights in January.
Exactly. Meanwhile, geopolitical tension just dominated the global narrative. The slow, grinding, corruption-shadowed war in Ukraine, the incredibly fragile ceasefire in Gaza, made even more complex by those explosive U.S. intelligence leaks. And crucially, that unexpected diplomatic rupture, the U.K. pausing intel sharing with the U.S., threatening a decades-old security cornerstone.
And tying it all together were those really profound markers of systemic change. Like you said, the quiet end of the 116-year Lincoln Cent era, signaling that accelerating digital shift in commerce, and that awesome but also high-stakes reminder from space, the G4 geomagnetic storm demanding we finally harden our grid.
If we really connect this to the bigger picture, all the events of November 12th, from the extreme weather-demanding infrastructure hardening, to the diplomatic rifts over intel use, to the systemic strain on S&P, they show a world increasingly defined by this collision, the collision between systemic fragility and rapid, unpredictable change.
It feels like we're constantly playing catch-up.
We are. The challenge isn't just solving these problems in isolation, it's addressing the systemic lack of resilience. Whether it's autonomous trucking firms trying to scale amidst fragmented rules, or ensuring the safety net survives political games, or protecting our power grid from the sun, the underlying weakness is often our 20th century governance and infrastructure models just struggling to keep pace with 21st century threats.
The real knowledge isn't just in the individual headline, is it? It's in how these seemingly localized events, the last penny, the S&P pause, the G4 storm, collectively reveal just how overwhelmingly complex global governance is today. It leaves you with this final thought, perhaps. When the crises are this diverse, hitting this rapidly, the question isn't just whether our political system is broken. It's maybe whether any system built on delayed reactions and temporary fixes is truly capable of managing simultaneous, sometimes existential threats.
Something to definitely mull over.
Something to mull over as you process these deep insights from November 12th, 2025.